Good afternoon. Doing a quick mic check, and once everything is good to go, we'll get things rolling. Let me know if you can hear me. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to another casual stroll through Lord of the Rings Online. My name is Matt Elliott. I go by Scenario on the message boards, and I'm a senior world designer working on Lord of the Rings Online. Those of you that are familiar with the stream know that we are nearing the end of all of the regions that we have to preview, but for those of you that are new, head on over to Twitch and to YouTube to check out the backlog. This is a world design focused stream where we are focusing on running through the landscapes of Lord of the Rings Online, talking about them, giving a little bit of behind the scenes, as well as answering the questions that you all have about the regions, about what goes into making the world of Middle-earth, making the landscape, the dungeons, just the general experience of it. With a little side dish of things like housing and other world design related things. As I usually say as part of these, because this is a world design focused stream, I'm not going to be talking about a lot of things that are outside of that realm. So things like lag, things like monster play, things like what's coming up for new game systems, or even too much into the specifics of what about quests and whatnot. I'm the landscape guy, I'm the dungeon guy, so that's the kind of content you'll get from me. So for this week, we are exploring the regions of Elderslade and Elderslade at War. This was introduced as part of the War of Three Peaks expansion pack, kind of the penultimate chapter of the Legacy of Dorne and the Trials of the Dwarves series of epic stories. This takes players all the way up to the entrance to Gundabad. That was one of the interesting things about building this, is we knew Gundabad was going to be next, and we really kind of wanted to leave it with a story cliffhanger, and we really had to make Gundabad something that wasn't accessible in terms of like what was available for players to actually like physically run into. And I think we had a pretty satisfying kind of story cliffhanger for that, and then players just kind of had to wait and see what was going to happen next, which always happens whenever we hit those story payoffs. But yeah. So for those of you that may not have played this region yet, Elderslade is probably, I would say, it's the third part of our Vales of Anduin trilogy, basically. We had the Vales of Anduin, the Wells of Langflood, and then we have up here, Elderslade. The idea kind of being that this region kind of is not, or these regions were not so deeply engrossed in the story of the dwarves as as Ered Mithrin was, for example. But there were ties to it and ties to the greater lore of Middle-earth leading up to that. But when we get to Elderslade, we find Elderslade in a state where the dwarves have returned. Durin has started to call the various dwarf kingdoms together to, build an army to retake Gundabad. This update also, I believe, introduced the mission system as well. And I have a bunch of the mission spaces that we'll take a look at as well, provided I get through the space fast enough. But yeah, so the kind of original pitch for this region was to kind of roll out Vales of Anduin, Wells of Langflood, and Elderslade as kind of one big region that was parsed out over the course of a year. And we changed our schedules a little bit because of just timing and availability of resources and whatnot. But now we are here. I had mentioned that this is the second to last region, and towards the end of the stream, we'll talk about what is the remaining region, and I know several people probably already are jumping in their seats knowing what region that is, and it's a region that I have long put off doing a run through. But yeah, so here we are in Elderslade. One of the things that I really appreciate about Elderslade is, similar to Wells of Langflood, less so in Vales of Anduin, but particularly in Wells of Langflood, is how rugged it is. It is this region that is kind of highlands. I mean, it is almost, if we had to redo the Highmoor from the Trollshaws, I feel like Elderslade is probably more of the kind of direction that we would go. This just has this. It's a much more like rugged and wild kind of feel to it, even though there's a very heavy dwarf architecture presence through all of it. One of the interesting geographic features of this is there are so many small rivers that come through the region, that cut through the region from the mountains and then eventually meet into and form the Anduin. But there are so many of them, and that naturally includes waterfalls as well, that one of the designers that was a fairly new designer at the time, they had come in not too long after we had started working on this, but we had gotten a good amount of work done. And their request was secret hidden waterfall caves within every single waterfall. And there are a lot of waterfalls in this region, and that ended up really not being something that was that valuable for us. So here we are. We're at the northern cliff, basically, between the Wells of Langflood and Elderslade, and you can kind of look down and you can see, where are we? Go down here to Misthallow. You can look down and you can see Framsburg from here. I think this region and Ironfold have some of the most kind of impressive cliffs we've seen in the game, and I love the cliffs in Ironfold because they do a good job of implying further southeast, and the cliffs here give you just an awesome vantage point to look down into the valleys below, into the Vales of Anduin and to the Wells of Langflood, Misthallow, all of that from here. But yeah, so so one of the comments from Mr. Alex: I always imagined the area around Gundabad to be more dark and dead, since most of the orcs were living there, and I think the interior portions of this region, that kind of holds true a little bit more. But one of the things that and admittedly we don't do super great about this is orcs are very sun averse. They are very sun shy. They don't like going out in the sun. Trolls in particular don't like it at all. Orcs are just very sensitive to it, and because of how sensitive they are to it, coming outside is no bueno for them. So they often prefer caves, or they prefer tunnels, or they prefer the cover of night. So that does give us some leeway here to not let it be a completely dark and desolate region. And there has to be some reason for the dwarves to want to come back here. If it is completely destroyed, there may be some reason for them to want to come back, but if it's completely destroyed, they're not necessarily going to have value in coming back to this space. That said, there's certainly a lot of destruction. You can see all of these buildings here, all of these structures here have columns and spires that have fallen, whether it's from our friends here, the Drakes, a dragon that may or may not be lurking around in this region, and just through wear and tear. You also have factions like the Angmarim that saw their kind of resurgence that ultimately culminated in the return to the reimagined Karn Dûm as part of all of this as well. So there are a lot of factions that kind of started culminating here again, kind of some new, some old, some returning, and I think that makes the landscape here much more complex. Now, this is compared to other regions a much smaller region than we typically produce, especially by current modern standards of world design. And like I said, that's in part due to just like what our original plans and goals were for this region as a whole. Um, Druid's Fire says, Legend of Zelda taught me to be disappointed when there isn't anything cool behind a waterfall. Lotro has occasionally made me happy in that regards. Um, yeah, and I think some of that holds true. Like if everything has something special behind it, then it's hard for anything to feel like it has something special going on behind it, right? So if every single waterfall has something cool behind it, you don't quite have that same kind of like gee whiz experience when you wander into a space and discover that it does have that. Um, and so, like, I think trying to preserve some of that and limit some of that is helpful when it comes to telling a story visually through a region. Um, I'm not going to go super far up north here because I do want to kind of swoop back down. Um, this is one of the mission. This is also this area is used very heavily as part of some of the missions that were introduced with this update as well. Um, but we make our way around. I do like the atmospheric change as we get higher up. You know, you walk into this area already and you can see the fog on your breath, but as you progress further in and you get higher up, we bring in more of the the gray haze, the fog, the snow, just to kind of make it feel like you're even further up in the mountains. Um, we work our way through here. This region too was one where it was like we were telling the story of the amassing of the armies of the dwarves, in addition to culminating the Proto-Rohirrim, the Eothiad stories that were being told through the Vales of Anduin and Wells of Langflood regions. So we kind of had these two big story anchors that worked their way through this region. And luckily, the Eothiad anchor kind of dovetailed into the villain for Gundabad fairly well. You know, there were motivations and reasons for the villain to be associated with where this arc ends up taking you. So that was a nice happenstance or design, I should say. Shouldn't say happenstance, should say design. That was intentional. Um, and yeah, we work our way here into Wormsgraft. So we'll go further into Wormsgraft later if I have time for it. But now let's make our way back down. See what we have for comments in here as well. Always happy to answer questions, so if you do have questions, feel free to drop them in chat. I know some people are probably furiously decorating the homes that they've purchased on the new 64-bit worlds, so I'm not going to slate them for that. I know this is an exciting time right now, so... Manadler says, the gorse bushes, the yellow flowers, give a sort of Scottish Highland look to it. Yeah, I mean, I think rugged arboreal region, you always want to have a little pop of color, a little splash of color somehow in these sorts of regions as you're building them, because, without it, you just have a very gray and brown space. And so you need something that kind of pops and livens up the region as you're going through it. Whether that is, in these like small flowering bushes here, or in the creatures themselves where you have kind of some, bright colors coming up on some of the drakes, or even some of these worms too that have a little bit more of a pink hue to them. Just something that casts a different color in the space. That is something that over the years we have experimented with different ways of showcasing that kind of thing. We want to lean very heavily into the color themes of a specific region, but we also don't want those themes to be too oppressive. So we need to find those ways, those tricks to brighten things up. I've talked about how Angmar, we were intentionally knowing Angmar was going to be this dark and gloomy and frankly terrifying space, and so we wanted to make sure that as we were building it, that we found those ways for colors, and we were hoping that we could leverage more colorful looking creatures, creatures with different skin, brighter skin color, reds and pinks and greens and whatnot to be where our color pops were. And I don't think we were particularly successful on that effort, in part because you don't see the monsters at a distance in the same way that you do the rocks and the buildings and whatnot. So here we are. We're progressing now. And where I just crossed ends up acting as the boundary line for what eventually becomes the Elderslade at War region. I think one of the things that we were really interested in doing, and I'll talk a little bit more in detail about it when we flip over into Elderslade at War, is to showcase a war zone. And so while this update did technically only have one region, it's more like, I would say, like 1.5, 1.25 regions, because we duplicated what we had built in Elderslade, and then we warred it up. We learned our lessons from Mordor Besieged and tried to address it and make it feel more like a satisfying war zone. Weird to say satisfying war zone, but there we have it. And then, this is another area where it's like things changed between those versions. This version is a, orc steadfast. And then when we switch over to the Warzone version, this is actually the main forward camp for the dwarves as they move their campaign towards the walls of Gundabad, which you can see up there in the distance. Thanodir says, on a personal level, are you still enjoying being out east for landscape? Do you miss working on the more known western regions? I'm really enjoying working in the eastern portions of the map, particularly in the unknown lands, right, or the lesser known lands, because that gives us a bit more of an opportunity to make our mark in regions that are very heavily detailed in the literature. It can be hard for us to find spots where we can infuse it with our own ideas and creativity and whatnot, because we want to stay true to the lore. When we have a space like Umbar, the Shield Isles, Ikerbon, those regions are very lightly touched at least as far as the source materials that we have available to us. And that gives us a lot more creative freedom to kind of stretch our wings, how we approach what the biomes look like, what textures are being used, what the cultures there, how those are represented. It just gives us a little bit more flexibility, and that gives us, it's fun to work with that kind of set of toys, basically. I think there are certainly times where you just want to sit down and you just want to build like a brie, and that is like an easy comfort food kind of region to make from a world building perspective. It is a classic European fantasy style space, and so building it for us is very second nature. It's not challenging, but it's good to have stuff like that to be able to kind of take a break sometimes, just shut off your brain, not have to think too hard about what you're working on, and just build something. That's why things like the Wildwood, why I made time and space for something like the Wildwood, because you get done building an expansion pack and your brain is kind of drained, and you just want something that's sort of low impact to work on. And so something like a Wildwood is a great way to kind of have that sort of low impact developmental experience, while still producing something new. Um, let's see. Rayvon Lunatic says, I know this is a bit off topic, but any chance of making old collector's editions like Helm's Deep have a brief return? I'm not someone that can answer that question for you. I know that there are aspects of some of those products that make it so that we can't really offer them again. The exclusive aspect of it. I think Cordovan has talked in the past about how there are, certain mounts or certain cosmetics that, players would love to get access to, but we can't really provide access to those cosmetics specifically anymore because they are exclusive, and there are kind of legally binding reasons why we can't offer those things. So. Mr. Alex asks, speaking of East, how would you imagine Rune? More like Persia, maybe like Chinese, or something completely different? I would say we will cross that bridge when we get to it. My brain is not in Rune mode currently, and I would need to, one, I would defer to whatever results come out of our research. If there's anything that indicates one thing or another for any region, regardless of whether it's a place that we've extensively worked in before or it's something that is, supremely brand new, we always lean into our research first and foremost. And something like Rune is something that we would lean heavily into our research first and foremost, and then from there put our own embellishments on top of it. What we think it should look like beyond what is available to us from the source materials. And like I've said before, even though we only have access to what is in The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings and their associated appendices, those are the only materials that we have specific access to when it comes to referencing in our content. We do pay attention to what is in all of the materials, what you find in, oh, he just kind of fell right out of the sky. What is in, the Silmarillion, Beren and Luthien, like all of those pieces, all of those works are still things that we pay attention to, and they help us inform what we're making, even if we can't specifically say what those things are, if that makes sense. Druid's Fire says, I appreciate when you do legally distinct recolors, redesigns of things to give something similar to some of those were, like the Isengard Dispeller outfits. And yeah, and that's where the wiggle room remains, but the original old school exclusive stuff probably has to remain pretty original old school exclusive. Goose Gubbin says, new player here, just subbed for 3 months. Thank you for making VIP accessible and affordable. You're welcome. I had nothing to do with that. So yeah, the way this region ended up being broken up amongst our world designers was very similar to how we used to build regions in the past. In part because this is a smaller region, we wanted to be all hands working on it. It's like a 1.5 regions worth of work. So the way we did this is we kind of split it up over chunks. One designer was like, okay, this river, you get everything to the east of it. Then you get everything in the middle, and then you get everything to the west of it. And that's how we divvied it up. One of the challenges working in this particular region, though, is because it's such a smaller space that we often had to be very cautious about where we were working so that we were not unintentionally stepping on each other's toes. oops, you worked on this file, but this file also covers this part of the landscape that you're working on. And so we had to like kind of better negotiate who was working on what when, which is very reminiscent of how we worked in the, the Shadows of Angmar regions, where, one person would be working in the northern part of Midgewater. That was what their assigned area was, and then another person would be working in the, Chetwood, south of Archet, and those areas are so close to each other, so we had to be very careful. But okay, I can do this kind of work on this day, and you do that kind of work that day, to make sure that we weren't disrupting each other while we were working on it. Thank you, Lost Shire Hobbit, for reminding me to take a drink. Ginger ale, here it goes. Rayvon Lunatic says, I love the designs of the enemy camps. I think a lot of our direction for a long time now at this point has been to push for more simplified monster camps and whatnot. Like I think with the original game we had, and I don't think I need to go too much further north here because we'll soon be getting up into Carbronach, because I believe this gate here was where we actually had things closed. But yeah, with the launch of the game, we had all of these different concepts and metrics for different styles of group camps, and group camps, small camps, large camps, solo camps, how big they were, how much scripting would happen within those camps. The Orc Valley, or what was it? And we'll go to North Downs. Yeah, Nan Wathrin here and Duldainen were both kind of like our centerpiece, like landscape as like either group content or landscape as, the content in here, you're going to spend like a 6-hour stretch doing this. And that was a very different period of time when it came to MMO designers, MMO players. We were like just getting past the like original MMO methodologies, right? Like your EverQuest, your Asheron's Call, your Ultima Onlines, where those games were very time dependent, right? There was a heavy requirement, heavy emphasis on spending a lot of time in those games. And as we've grown individually, as people, as we've grown as a studio, as our design skills have changed and grown, as our player base have changed and grown, and how as all of us have grown up. Because it is a little weird to say, but there are many players of our games that have grown up playing Lord of the Rings Online, right? Like they started as a kid, and now they themselves are adults with kids of their own. So as everything around the game has matured, that kind of gameplay, that heavy, intense, huge time investment on whether it's landscapes or instances, that thought process behind gaming has really changed a lot. And so those kinds of camps have kind of fallen by the wayside, and we're leaning into more like simpler designs, things that can more easily be gotten into and out of as you're playing, things that, from a designer perspective, we don't need to have as heavy a hand in building and in the gameplay of those spaces, because a lot of players aren't necessarily there to be beat up by camp content, by something like this. Like they don't want to have to spend 4 hours just trying to get their way into this point. I think for the players that do want that challenge, we have things like the landscape difficulty system, that is more specifically intended to kind of provide that sort of challenge. Um, so yeah, as we've all grown, the thought process behind the game has changed, and I think it's changed um, for the better because of it. And we've also just we've gotten good at how we build our camps. We know what amount of decoration feels right. We know what a density of monsters feel right. We know, how light like we know how to throw it together. We know how to build it more effectively than we did when we started the game. Thanodeer says, if you could go back and redo any region with knowledge and tech now available, what would you choose? Um, there has been a part of me that has recently been kind of wistful about the North Downs and how, compared to what was done in Breland and how that was opened up and redetailed for the original Legendary servers, and then just how we've approached building Swanfleet and Cardalon. Um, there is a part of me that looks at um, the North Downs, particularly uh, the Fields of Fornost and Fornost itself, and all the way to Estelden, um, and kind of like thinks, well, it would be nice to be able to like re-terraform this and give it some more modern love, because I feel like of the regions that we have, the North Downs doesn't quite feel like it hits the character that the content of the North Downs says it does, right? Like, I think the way we set up the North Downs story wise, wants it to be like the breadbasket of Breland, right? Like it wants it to be, farmlands under threat from the orcs. It wants it to be, adventurers and passerbys dealing with the threats within Fornost. Like it's and I feel like the flavor of the North Downs doesn't quite hit that same note. Um, so yeah, that would be my where I would lean. Um, so back to Elderslade, Duntrack is a camp that is very near and dear to me, because it's not it represents a sort of space that we don't get to build all that often, and that is like an enemy city, like, and not even like city, like an enemy village that is actually like buildings. A lot of our enemy camps have these, their campfires, their tents, and whatnot, kind of in the wilderness. And this was a fun opportunity to kind of rediscover the old Angmar assets that we had and kind of reimagine what Angmarim culture could be like when it was not directly just Carn evil, Carn evil. And completely honestly, building this is in large part what inspired me to undertake the like reimagining of Carn as one of my like little side projects, which eventually became the return of Carn. Um, so like these were really fun. Like I've always loved the Angmarim Tudor buildings, and the Croftlands structures are also just like really, really great, simple building pieces. And so combining them with the Angmarim walls and whatnot, I felt like there was a really strong visual language out of this that could then further be employed elsewhere. And to be fair too, like this inspired a lot of my work in Omphalos, in the towns of Omphalos as well. Like being, figuring out how to use the crofter assets, figuring out how to use the tutor assets, figuring out how to combine them with other stronger, like bigger stone structures was, and kind of imagine it in a fresher, different way, was something that I really, really enjoyed doing. And it's something that really kind of inspired me to think about towns like, what were the towns in? Sorry, I gotta hit the map again. We're going Gondor, we're going here. So, Melgabus, Bairdfane, Lon Curion, Ost Arndir, like all of those towns and the way that they were constructed and laid out, they wouldn't have been built in that way if I hadn't built this. Because this was kind of what got me thinking about, like, how do we build towns? How do we lay them out? How do we construct them? Because outside of, like, the big stuff like Minas Tirith, a lot of our towns were just like, here's a few buildings, here's a road and a well. And there wasn't a lot of, I don't want to say urban planning, but there wasn't a ton of thought put to those because, we're like burning fast, we're building fast. And so building this town, this village of Angmarum, was just really inspiring for a lot of things going forward in the future, at least as far as the work that I've been doing, or was doing at the time. So we have made it through, all the way through, so we've traversed from the edges of Arid Mithrin up to Wormsgrath, back down, all along here, almost to Carboronach, and then through the gates of Gundabad to where we are now. So it's time to kind of flip over into Elderslade at War. So the story behind Elderslade at War was that the dwarf armies were beginning to march towards the gates of Gundabad to try to start to reclaim it. And we wanted to really portray a war zone here. We had most recently built the Mordor besieged region, and both from our own internal feedback and review process, as well as just what we had seen from the player base, in general, the feedback was kind of, well, this doesn't feel like a war is happening here, kind of thing. So with this region, we really wanted to hit home the idea that it's under attack, it's under siege, there's a war happening. It is a much smaller portion of Elderslade, and you can see where I am here on the map. This portion was previously explorable, but now we're very much more restricted to, it's really just the main valley up to the gates of Gundabad. But we tried to make sure that we were showing the state of war on the region more so than what we had done with Mordor Besieged. Mordor Besieged, it didn't feel like it was a siege happening for the fate of Middle-earth. So we really wanted to make sure that between the version of Elderslade that players had been doing their normal content in, up through to when the actual conflict happens, which is where we're at now with the War of Three Peaks, Elderslade at War region. We wanted to make sure that the change between the versions was very, very substantial. So you have, what we were looking at back there were these like flaming boulders that had wrecked the roads and blocked access further to the east. You have these trenches here where the dwarves have kind of dug in and refortified areas to make it more difficult for opposing armies to come through. You have these battlefields that are, just corpses, dwarves and orcs strewn about. Continuing, kind of our experimentation with scene files. Like normally, in the past we would have hand placed all of these ourselves, but we're leveraging our scene file system instead to kind of build these little vignettes, so that we're not feeling like we're just exhausted by placing corpse after corpse after corpse and rotating it this way and rotating it that way. The change here, we wanted to have it feel like something different was happening. All of the POIs that you are familiar with in these areas have a difference to them. You have these like clouds of miasma that just randomly spawn in different parts of the landscape to kind of force you to kind of change how you're moving around the region. You have random hill beasts just chilling out up on walls. So the idea here was to make it feel different but familiar. Have things like these skirmishes happening, and you'll often see dwarf NPCs out fighting the normal things on the landscape. I'm just going to let them sort that out themselves. So yeah. So Thanadir says, fair enough. I always tend to arrive at Fornost over level. I need to do the landscape area on level one day. I think that's one of the challenging things at low level anyways, is our game splits paths eventually. You go the Lonelands route, or you go the North Downs route. And because of that path split, whatever path you don't take, you're of course going to be over leveled for when it comes time for you to participate in that content, or you get around to doing the vectors that would take you to that content. So I can get the like, oh, I'm just kind of face rolling this kind of experience from there. I think having the multiple paths is great for the health of the game across all levels, and it's something that I personally am striving to advocate for as we continue to build the game and grow the game. Making sure that where we have those spots where there could stand to be, more content for a given level, just to give people that even like to roll alts an opportunity to do something new that they haven't done before. I think it's good and important to have those things, even if it does mean that you outlevel places. Druidsfire says, you definitely got the Warzone vibe, particularly that the harkening back to IRL trench warfare that Tolkien would have been familiar with. And Mr. Alex says, it looks like Warzone from World War I. And I think that was, the point. Lots of trench warfare going on in here. And using the trenches to some degree to markate the line between, this is what the dwarves held, and this is what the orcs have. And so we have these just like skirmishes from parties that have landed, or like these boats here that very clearly crashed, and there's a very proud orc celebrating the crashed boat. Those war mammoths. But yeah, we wanted to evoke that feel of change. You spent however many hours in this region before doing the normal landscape content and all of the preambles up to it, and now you're here and you're actually seeing the difference. It's not quite the same as the world changes that you see in something like Archit, and those kinds of world changes have fallen out of favor a little bit, just in terms of trying to turn around and build things quickly and trying to keep being able to work in tandem. Someone could be working in this area at the same time as someone else working in the normal version. Thanadir says, I like Pass. I just struggle to stray from the zones the epic story takes me to. And that's completely fair, too. I think, too, we are very generous with experience points in the game. And it can make it very easy to out-level quickly, especially if you are VIP or you have any of the pre-order perks and whatnot. Super, super, super easy to out-level a space with all of that stuff going on. Mr. Alex says it would be nice if War Elderslade had fellowship quests and maybe some raid bosses. Yeah, I think the challenge is it being a part of normal content. We weren't intending it to be a full-blown fellowship region. Certainly might get a little bit tougher, but not really intending it to be a fellowship space. So I think this just about covers our trip through Elderslade at War. So now we can start getting... Oh, even the orcs have their own little trenches. So now we can start going through some of the dungeon spaces that are introduced here. And boy, are there lots of little interiors in this region. So we'll start probably with the primary interior. This is Anarkufu. Sorry, Curfew. This is the main hub for the region. It kind of acts as your, catch-all for everything. If you need it as a normal town services hub, you've got it down here. And then you head on upstairs, and this is where the action is when it comes to the mission content and preparing for war. I think many people that have done this content are very, very familiar with this room. I was particularly happy with this Gundabad-ish relief in the wall here to kind of exhibit things. And then we've got the war table here too, which these are always fun to see as just like mock-ups to have in a space, especially since this one has a little bit of the relief to it. As part of this content too, I had mentioned we were telling the story of the Ithuda. And so in the lead up to that, this takes us here to the Ill-Fated Feast, which is a story space that tells a little bit more story of the Ithuda, the people that would become the Rohirrim, and the characters associated with that, as well as some special guests that are known by different names. Since it is apparent that there are a few people that haven't gotten to this content yet, I'm going to try to be a little bit more tactful in spoilers. I really like the look of this interior. It kind of makes me want to build some more stuff in this style. And honestly, looking at this, it's these sorts of things where you see these sorts of things and you're like, oh, well, why couldn't this look like that too? So when we were talking about things like Fornost and whatnot, it might be nice to have Fornost have a little bit more of a... I don't know that humble is the right word, but certainly a less grand look to it, right? Because we have an Numenos right nearby, and I always feel like Fornost wants to be kind of like the cozy castle compared to a Numenos's grand capital city castle. Druid's Fire says, can't wait until Corey does. He's arrived at Limlock in the Epic. I'm going to push for him to do the Aothiad side quest on his next weekend marathon. For those of you that aren't aware of Corey, he is a professor that actually teaches classes in our game, talking about Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit. And he's been slowly taking his class through those narratives through our game, which is a really, really, really cool and interesting experience. And it's really awesome to have built something that can serve those kinds of purposes as well. We also have things like Weatherstock, the concerts that are player-driven events that happen, on Weathertop. So it is, I've said it before, but it really is nice that, our community has that kind of reach and interest in doing those sorts of things on their own. We have our bat cave. This was on the, this cave here is in the island that's in the middle of the big lake, in front of Gundabad, the entrance to Gundabad. We have here, which I'm just now realizing is all sorts of glowy and whatnot, and it is not intentionally all sorts of glowy. I think what happened here is at some point when I had first built this, we had set up the look and feel of the space, and then I had put a wrong piece of data into these appearances, and then we added the new glowy appearance, and because I had the wrong data in, it now just takes the new glowy appearance, which I'm not necessarily opposed to, and it is kind of a nice teaser. Oh, hey, buddy. That's right. Forgot you were in here. These were all, like, it is, I think we had probably about 15 or 20 small interiors that were made for this region. A few of them were like at-war versions, so there's an at-war version of this, there's an at-war version of a ward cave, those sorts of things. But there were a lot of like little spaces that were made for this that did I? Oh, that's where my typo was. There we go. Lots of little interiors for this space, and I think that also just helps the character of it all. Let's see. Mr. Alex says, come on now, scenario, show us any hint of upcoming regions. There will be a time and a place for upcoming region hints. That time and that place is not in the immediate future. Rest assured that we will do previews of all of the work that's coming out for the expansion packs, or rather the expansion pack later this year. And I know there is a certain space coming up for a certain portion of some certain islands that people have been noticing and are excited about, as well as a certain housing neighborhood that people are aware of and excited about. And all of those things will also get their own previews when it is time to preview those things. So we only have a couple more minutes left, so I'm going to skip the at-war versions of these spaces because I do want to take a look at some of the spaces that were made for the missions as well. I did all of these are all my hand, and these are all just fun spaces to build where we needed to just. We wanted to make sure each one kind of had its own little character of some sort. Something to make it feel unique and distinct in its own. So you have this, which is Akualagam, but internally we called it Anvil Road. Because the idea being that this might be kind of a back way into the Anvil. I think with spaces like this too, they're great because a designer can make their pitch for something, and it can easily translate into something that looks like this based off of their like quick short paragraph synopsis of what they want the look and feel of this space to be. And then we've got a bunch of spaces that are mission spaces that I'm sure everyone will be familiar with. I like the feel of these spaces and how like cluttered they can feel just as you're moving around in them. Busy, but not so busy that they are too confusing, but hopefully simple enough that the map can easily show you where you need to go and what you need to do. I think with these spaces too, we experimented a little bit with different kinds of lighting and different ways of kind of building modularly. We've got the armory. I think too, with working with, how I was talking about with the Angmarum stuff and working with those assets and figuring out new ways to develop them, to use them, to create visual language. All of the dwarf stuff, both like in this and in Gundabad itself, that was also a huge amount of, and I mean, to be fair too, starting with what we were doing in Arid Mithrin, was experimenting with the dwarf assets and trying to use them in ways that really didn't, we really hadn't used them before. Not just, oh, we're going to put this down and rotate it certain ways, but thinking about like, oh, well, if I rotate it 90 degrees this way and 90 degrees that way, then this asset kind of stops being just a column, but now it can be a strut, it can be a support. If I put like 4 of these things together into this kind of pattern, then I can make it look like it's a ornate theme, an ornate wall as opposed to just a flat wall. So there was a lot of that kind of experimentation happening with these assets as we were working on them too, because we we try to do as much as we can with existing assets, but that also means that if we don't experiment with how we're using those assets, then that usage can run stagnant a little, right? It can feel samey. So we want to try to find new ways to use what we're using, what we have, to build something, like different and interesting. And I think this is the one. This dungeon too ends in kind of a similar thing where it's like, oh, here are these different assets, and I just combine them together, and now we have this very distinct look. So you have everyone knows Mustache Falls from Moria, so we have this giant dwarf head relief. But now it's like, okay, well, let's take these fence pieces and jam them in and then stick a couple of campfires up here. And now we have this kind of like goblin corrupted dwarf structure that, we didn't necessarily need new assets for, but it's something that, when we started playing around with it, we're like, oh, well, hey, that is cool. Mr. Alex says, missions in Elderslades are unique, and they're taking place all across the northern regions, and they're changing each day. On the other side, the missions like Umbar doesn't feel the same. So yeah, I think with the launch of the missions in Elderslade and through Gundabad and whatnot, we really wanted to make sure that there is an opportunity to kind of cycle through them, to have those sorts of different experiences. I think with Umbar, I can't speak specifically to the design direction. I thought there was supposed to be some cycling through in some of them to kind of keep gameplay compelling. You want to come back over and over again. Um, but I think we're also still always experimenting with how we present them, because there have been times too where we've gotten feedback of like someone really wanted to play a certain mission and they couldn't because it was off, it was off rotation. So there's always that balancing act of like on rotation, off rotation. Do we want to make them always available? Do we want to make them limited available? Like those sorts of things. Um, and I think people take away different experiences from those kinds of approaches. Alrighty. Well, we are just over 3 o'clock, so I think it is time to wrap up this stream. Thank you, everyone, for being here, asking your questions, hanging out with me as we went through the last, what do I want to say, questing region of the game that we've built so far. There is still one more region left as part of these Casual Stroll streams. It is the one region that I have avoided doing for the longest time, in part because it's not really associated with the normal questing experience, and that is the region of Etten. So our next Casual Stroll stream, we will be exploring the Etten. It is something that is definitely an effort of love region that a couple of designers kind of picked up and propped up and tried to make the most out of it. And we'll dig into that a little bit next time. In the meantime, for those of you that have moved your characters over onto the new 64-bit worlds, housing is in its rollout now. So if you want to pick up your house, pay attention to announcements and whatnot to know which neighborhoods are going to be available when, so you can pop in and try to get the homes that you want. I think April Fool's stuff ends today, if it hasn't already. I do know that we've got Spring Festival stuff coming up soon, and anniversary stuff coming up soon. Next week, on our We Have a Cave Troll stream, which is myself and Alan Mackey, or Ryan, where we hang out and talk about whatever we feel like talking about. That's Thursday at 3 p.m. We're going to have a special guest with us. One of our designers, MVP, is going to be hanging out with us for the hour too. And we're going to be talking about festivals because there are a lot of festival stuff that's going to be coming up over the next several months. So yeah, we're excited to have that be our topic for next week's stream. So thank you everyone for coming here, hanging out, asking your questions, and we'll see you all next week.